It's a regular summer night in Salt Lake City. A 14-year-old girl is fast asleep in her bedroom, sharing the space with her younger sister. In just a few hours, she'll become the center of one of the most shocking kidnapping cases America has ever seen. But here's the twist. The man who's about to walk through her bedroom door, her family had actually hired him to do yard work months earlier. Talk about a nightmare you never see coming. June 4th, 2002. Started out pretty normal for the Smart family. Elizabeth was crushing it at her middle school award ceremony, picking up honors in physical fitness and academics. She was supposed to play her harp that night, but the family was running late, so that didn't happen. They headed home, everyone went to bed, and that's when this story takes a dark turn that'll make your blood run cold. Around 3 in the morning, that dead quiet time when the whole world's asleep, a man crept into the Smart home in the Federal Heights neighborhood. This wasn't some random break-in gone wrong. This dude had a plan, and it was absolutely twisted. He made his way upstairs to the bedroom where Elizabeth and her 9-year-old sister Mary Catherine were sleeping. Now here's where it gets real intense. Mary Catherine woke up. Can you imagine? You're 9 years old, you wake up in the middle of the night, and there's a stranger standing in your bedroom. But this brave kid, she played it smart. She pretended to be asleep, keeping her eyes barely open, watching everything go down. What she witnessed would haunt her for months, and ultimately help crack the case wide open. The intruder was calm, almost eerily polite. He was dressed nicely, spoke in a soft voice, and approached Elizabeth's bed with a knife. Let me repeat that. This guy threatened a sleeping 14-year-old with a blade. Elizabeth stirred, stubbed her toe on a chair as she got up and said, "Ouch." The man's response, "You better be quiet and I won't hurt you." Elizabeth, terrified and confused, asked the question anyone would ask. "Why are you doing this?" The man's answer was barely audible, but Mary Catherine thought she heard him say something about ransom. But that wasn't it at all. What this sicko actually had planned was way worse. As the kidnapper forced Elizabeth out of the room, Mary Catherine tried to make a break for her parents' bedroom. But check this out. She almost got spotted. The guy and Elizabeth were right outside her brother's room, and she nearly walked straight into them. This 9-year-old had to creep back to her bed and hide there, scared out of her mind, for over 2 hours. Think about that. 2 hours. Finally, just before 4 in the morning, Mary Catherine worked up the courage to wake her parents and tell them what happened. And here's the heartbreaking part. They didn't believe her at first. They thought she'd had a nightmare. It wasn't until they found a window screen that had been sliced open with a knife that the horrible truth sank in. Elizabeth was gone. So who was this guy? And what kind of person does something like this? Before we dive into this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and smash the like. It helps this community grow and makes sure stories like this one aren't forgotten. This case took decades to crack, and trust me, you're not going to want to miss a single detail. Also, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how many people around the world care about justice just as much as I do. Meet Brian David Mitchell, born October 18th, 1953, right there in Salt Lake City. Third kid out of 6 in a family that belonged to the LDS Church. On paper, his childhood looked pretty standard. Mom was a teacher. Dad was a social worker, but scratch beneath the surface, and you'll find some seriously messed up parenting choices that might have set the stage for what was to come. Get this, Mitchell's dad thought the best way to teach his teenage son about sex was to show him explicit photos from medical journals. And his idea of teaching independence? He'd drive young Brian to random parts of the city, drop him off, and make him find his own way home. I'm not saying this made Mitchell into what he became, but it definitely wasn't winning any Father of the Year awards. By 16, Mitchell was already showing red flags. He exposed himself to a child and got sent to juvenile detention. At 19, he married a 16-year-old girl named Karen Miner. Yeah, you heard that right. And they had 2 kids together. After their divorce, Karen got custody, and Mitchell straight up kidnapped his own children and fled to New Hampshire. He lived there for 2 years in a Hare Krishna commune. This pattern of running away and ignoring the law, it was just getting started. Mitchell had issues with drugs and booze throughout his 20s. When he came back to Salt Lake City, his brother, who'd just returned from a church mission, inspired him to get sober. Mitchell got married again, this time to a woman named Debbie, who already had 3 kids from a previous marriage. Together, they had 2 more kids, but Debbie later said Mitchell was abusive during their marriage. And when they split in 1984, she made an even more disturbing allegation. She claimed Mitchell had sexually abused their 3-year-old son. Doctors couldn't confirm it medically, but the courts weren't taking chances. From then on, Mitchell could only see his kids with a social worker watching. One of Debbie's daughters later came forward saying Mitchell had sexually abused her for 4 years. Now, You'd think this guy would be on everyone's radar, right? But here's the wild part. The very day his divorce from Debbie was finalized, Mitchell married again. Wife number 3 was Wanda Elaine Barzee, a 40-year-old divorcee with 6 kids of her own. And Barzee? She was a whole other level of disturbing. Her own daughter later called her a monster and claimed that when she was a kid, Barzee killed her pet rabbit and fed it to her for dinner. Let that sink in. Mitchell and Barzee became super active in the LDS church together. But then Mitchell started getting weird. He began calling himself Emmanuel David Isaiah, claiming he was a prophet of God who had visions. He believed he was some kind of chosen servant mentioned in a religious book about Isaiah. Barzee went all in with him, changing her name to Hephzibah Elada Isaiah. The two of them started dressing in white robes and tunics, like they were cosplaying Jesus and his disciples. Mitchell grew out his beard, and they'd panhandle and preach in downtown Salt Lake City. The church was like, yeah, we're done with this, and excommunicated them both in June 2002. Literally the same month, Mitchell kidnapped Elizabeth. But here's the connection that'll blow your mind. About 7 months before the kidnapping, Elizabeth's mom, Lois Smart, found Mitchell begging for change downtown. Feeling charitable, she hired him to do some work around their house, fixing the roof, raking leaves. He worked for maybe 5 hours total. The family knew him as Emmanuel, and that brief encounter, it gave Mitchell everything he needed to plan his crime. After Mitchell dragged Elizabeth out of her house at knife point, he forced her to walk 4 miles through the woods. 4 miles. In her nightgown, in the middle of the night. Can you even imagine the terror running through this 14-year-old's mind? They ended up at a camp Mitchell had set up in the woods outside Salt Lake City, where Barzee was waiting. And what happened next is absolutely stomach-turning. According to Elizabeth's own testimony years later, Barzee washed her feet and told her to change out of her pajamas into a robe. When Elizabeth refused, Barzee threatened to have Mitchell come and rip her clothes off. Terrified, Elizabeth put on the robe. Then Mitchell performed what he called a ceremony. He was marrying her to him, and immediately after this sick ritual, he raped her, not once, but repeatedly that night. Mitchell kept telling Elizabeth she was blessed this was happening to her, that she should be thankful. This guy actually tried to make her believe being kidnapped and raped was some kind of honor. He claimed to be an angel, said he was a Davidic king who would emerge in 7 years, be stoned by a mob, lie dead in the streets for 3 days, and then rise up and kill the Antichrist. According to his twisted worldview, Elizabeth was the first of many virgin brides he planned to kidnap to help him battle the Antichrist. To keep Elizabeth from escaping, they shackled her to a tree with a metal cable around her leg. She could only move a few feet outside the tent. Sometimes they'd hide her in a hole covered with boards. She was forced to take a new name. She chose Esther, after the biblical figure, though Mitchell also called her Shir Jashub. The abuse was relentless. Mitchell raped Elizabeth multiple times a day. He forced her to look at pornographic magazines. He regularly threatened to kill her. He made her drink alcohol and take drugs to lower her resistance. They starved her and literally fed her garbage. And Barzee? She wasn't just standing by. She was actively helping Mitchell abuse this child. Elizabeth would later call Barzee the most evil woman she'd ever met. But here's what's absolutely insane. They took Elizabeth out in public multiple times. They went to the Salt Lake City Public Library. They went to grocery stores. They went to restaurants. They even attended a party where someone took a photo of them. How did nobody recognize her? Mitchell and Barzee dressed Elizabeth in robes, veils, and headscarves that covered most of her face. They claimed it was for religious reasons, that they belonged to some strict faith where women had to be completely covered, and people just bought it. The closest call happened at the library in August 2002, about 2 months into Elizabeth's captivity. A library patron noticed them because they looked so unusual. All 3 dressed head to toe in robes and veils. This patron looked closely at Elizabeth's eyes and got suspicious enough to call the cops. A police detective actually showed up. He confronted Mitchell, Barzee, and Elizabeth right there in the library. This was it, the moment Elizabeth could have been rescued. But Mitchell spun this whole story about how Elizabeth was his daughter, Augustine Marshall, and they couldn't remove their veils because of their religion. When the detective tried to question them, Mitchell said their religion prohibited women from speaking in public. Barzee and Elizabeth stayed silent, with Barzee signaling Elizabeth not to move, gripping her legs under the table. The detective bought the story and walked away. Elizabeth later described that moment as feeling like hope was walking out the door. She was furious with herself for not speaking up, for not taking the chance. She was mad at the detective for not pushing harder. So close, yet still trapped. In September 2002, Mitchell and Barzee decided to leave Utah altogether, taking Elizabeth with them to San Diego County, California. They set up camp in a dry creek bed in Lakeside. Over the following months, they moved several times to different encampments, often relocating in the middle of the night. In February 2003, Mitchell got arrested in El Cajon for breaking into a church. He spent several days in jail, but nobody recognized him as the wanted kidnapper from Utah. He was released, and the nightmare continued. Back in Salt Lake City, the search for Elizabeth was massive. The Laura Recovery Center organized efforts that brought in up to 2,000 volunteers a day. They had search dogs, planes, websites with flyers people could print and share. The community went all out trying to find this girl, but the investigation was hitting walls left and right. Mary Catherine's description of the kidnapper didn't give them much to work with. She said he was white, about 5'8", somewhere between 30 and 40 years old, wearing light-colored clothes and a golf hat. Thing is, Mitchell was actually wearing black, didn't have a golf hat, and was 48 years old. She also said she never got a clear look at his face, a fact police kept secret during the investigation. There was basically no usable evidence at the scene, no fingerprints, no DNA. The bloodhounds came up empty. Police questioned hundreds of potential suspects. The investigation even ended up sending several unrelated criminals back to prison. But Elizabeth? Still missing. Early on, cops zeroed in on a guy named Richard Ricci as a person of interest. Ricci was a handyman with a drug problem who'd done work for the Smarts before. He'd been jailed for an unrelated parole violation earlier. Ricci became their prime suspect. But in August 2002, he died of a brain hemorrhage. Dead end. Literally. The Smart family fought to keep Elizabeth's name in the press. They made a website, shared home videos, went on television, anything to keep the public searching. Ed and Lois Smart appeared on TV the day after the kidnapping, pleading for whoever took their daughter to bring her home. Months passed. Summer turned to fall. Then, in October 2002, 4 months after Elizabeth was taken, Mary Catherine had what she later described as an epiphany. She remembered the voice, that soft-spoken, weirdly polite voice the kidnapper used that night. She suddenly realized where she'd heard it before. It belonged to the homeless guy they'd hired to work on their roof, the man they knew as Emmanuel. The cops were skeptical, and honestly, who could blame them? The guy had only worked for the family for about 5 hours, 7 months before the kidnapping. Mary Catherine had only heard brief snippets of conversation. How could she possibly be sure after all this time? But the Smart family pushed forward. They hired a sketch artist to draw Emmanuel's face based on their descriptions. In February 2003, 9 months after Elizabeth disappeared, they released that sketch to the media. It appeared on Larry King Live and America's Most Wanted. And boom! Mitchell's own relatives recognized the drawing. They gave police recent photographs of him. Finally, law enforcement had a real lead. March 12, 2003. Sandy, Utah. 2 separate couples were out and about when they spotted something that made them stop and stare. A man with 2 females, all dressed in unusual clothing. The man looked exactly like the photos of Brian David Mitchell they'd seen on the news. Both couples immediately called the Sandy Police Department. Within minutes, officers were on the scene. Mitchell was there. So was Barzee. And there was a girl with them, disguised in a gray wig, sunglasses, a veil, and a t-shirt wrapped around her head. When officers approached and asked questions, the girl told them her name was Augustine Marshall. But the cops weren't buying it. They separated her from Mitchell and Barzee and started questioning her more closely. Officer Karen Jones even handcuffed her. Protocol demanded it, while Sergeant Victor Quezada asked directly, "Are you Elizabeth?" Elizabeth's response, "Thou sayest." It was an old biblical phrase meaning, "You said it," or essentially, yes. That's when they knew for sure, after 9 months, Elizabeth Ann Smart had been found alive. But here's something that'll break your heart. Even after being separated from her captors, Elizabeth initially seemed concerned about what would happen to them. While being driven to the police station, she started crying and asked, "What's going to happen to them? Are they going to be okay?" Some people later speculated about Stockholm Syndrome, but Elizabeth herself firmly denied that in a 2017 TV film about her experience. She explained that after months of psychological manipulation, threats, and abuse, she'd been conditioned to believe her captors' twisted worldview. Not that she actually cared about them. At the station, Elizabeth was finally reunited with her family. Can you even imagine that moment? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and smash the like. It helps this community grow and makes sure stories like this one aren't forgotten. This case took decades to crack, and trust me, you're not going to want to miss a single detail. Also, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how many people around the world care about justice just as much as I do. After 9 months of hell, suddenly she's back with her mom, her dad, her siblings. She was home. The Smart family tried to help Elizabeth ease back into normal life. That first day back, she watched a movie, read emails from well-wishers, played her harp, met the family's 2 new dogs, and slept in the same bed Mitchell had taken her from, which honestly seems like it would have been traumatic. But maybe it was about reclaiming what had been stolen. The next day, they threw her a party to make up for her 15th birthday, which had passed while she was in captivity. Elizabeth didn't attend the party, but she sent a poster board that read, "I am the luckiest girl in the world." She painted her nails. She opened birthday presents. A family friend cut her hair. She was trying to move forward. But the legal system? That was about to turn into its own nightmare. On March 18, 2003, Mitchell and Barzy were charged with aggravated kidnapping, aggravated sexual assault, and aggravated burglary. Open and shut case, right? This sicko kidnapped and raped a child for 9 months. Lock him up and throw away the key. But it wasn't that simple. Not even close. The court ordered Mitchell to undergo a competency evaluation because of his claims of being a prophet with religious visions. While waiting for the evaluation, Mitchell was held at the Utah State Hospital. A psychologist named Stephen Golding, hired by the defense, concluded that Mitchell's beliefs weren't just religious zeal. They were actual delusions. In Golding's opinion, Mitchell wasn't competent to stand trial. The court disagreed and found Mitchell competent in 2004. Plea negotiations started. Mitchell's team said he'd plead guilty to kidnapping and burglary for 10-15 years, but only if Elizabeth didn't have to testify. The prosecution refused. They weren't dropping the sexual assault charges. No deal. Then in February 2005, another psychologist, Jennifer Scheme, who'd initially said Mitchell was competent, interviewed him again at the defense's request. Afterward, Mitchell's attorney filed a brief saying Mitchell was no longer competent to stand trial. Suddenly, Mitchell started acting out in court, singing hymns, screaming at judges. Yet jail staff reported no changes in his behavior behind bars. Still, Judge Judy Atherton agreed with the defense, saying Mitchell's courtroom antics reflected psychosis. Mitchell went back to Utah State Hospital on August 11, 2005, and stayed there until 2008. The whole time he was in the hospital, staff members never observed him being paranoid or psychotic. In other words, he was playing the system like a fiddle. In February 2006, Utah passed a bill allowing prosecutors to request forcible medication on defendants to restore their competence to stand trial. The state sought permission to forcibly medicate both Mitchell and Barzee, citing a Supreme Court case that permits this when there's a compelling state interest. A judge approved forcibly medicating Barzee so she could face trial. In December 2006, Mitchell was again declared unfit to stand trial after screaming at a judge to forsake those robes and kneel in the dust. Doctors had been trying to treat him without drugs, but after that courtroom scene, prosecutors said they'd likely request permission to forcibly medicate him too. By December 2008, it was determined that Utah couldn't legally force Mitchell to take medication, calling it unnecessary and needlessly harsh. This went on for years. While Elizabeth tried to rebuild her life, the man who destroyed her childhood kept gaming the system. Finally, in October 2008, Mitchell's case was transferred to federal court. The competency issue remained the main obstacle. The court held evidentiary hearings in October and November-December 2009. During one hearing, Mitchell burst out singing hymns in court. During another, Elizabeth testified, describing Mitchell as smart, articulate, evil, wicked, manipulative, sneaky, slimy, selfish, greedy, not spiritual, not religious, not close to God. 3 experts presented competency evaluations. Dr. Noel Gardner believed Mitchell was fully aware of his actions and was deceiving the court. Dr. Michael Wellner reviewed 210 sources and conducted 57 interviews, producing a 206-page report. Wellner concluded Mitchell was competent and diagnosed him with pedophilia, antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, malingering, and alcohol abuse. Wellner believed Mitchell was highly manipulative and used religious expression to make people dismiss him as delusional when he was actually high-functioning. Defense experts didn't dispute these diagnoses, but maintained Mitchell had a fixed delusional disorder that impaired his judgment at the time of the crime. On March 1, 2010, nearly 8 years after the kidnapping, Mitchell was finally deemed competent to stand trial. His trial began November 8, 2010. The defense admitted Mitchell committed the crimes, but argued he was legally insane at the time and should be found not guilty by reason of insanity. On December 11, 2010, the jury rejected the insanity defense. Mitchell was found guilty of kidnapping and transporting a minor across state lines with intent to engage in sexual activity. U.S. District Judge Dale A. Kimball sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. Mitchell is currently serving his sentence at U.S. Penitentiary Terre Haute in Indiana, a high-security federal prison where he'll die behind bars. Barzee had already pleaded guilty and been sentenced to concurrent 15-year terms in state and federal prison. In 2016, her federal sentence ended and she was transferred to Utah State Prison. Then, in September 2018, the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole announced she'd be released because they'd failed to credit her for time served in federal prison. Elizabeth protested Barzee's release loudly, but it didn't matter. On September 19, 2018, after serving 9 years, 72-year-old Wanda Barzee walked free. She's on parole under federal supervision for 5 years and registered as a sex offender in Utah. 3 months after her release, it came out that Barzee was living near a Salt Lake City elementary school. Utah rules don't restrict how close sex offenders can live to schools. They just can't go on school property. In May 2025, Barzee was arrested again for visiting parks in violation of Utah laws restricting sex offender movements. Elizabeth Smart didn't let what happened to her define her entire life. But she also didn't hide from it. She became a powerful advocate for missing persons and victims of sexual assault. She married Matthew Gilmore in February 2012 after they met during a Mormon mission in 2009. Together, they have 3 children, a daughter born in February 2015, a son in April 2017, and another daughter in November 2018. As of 2023, the family lives in Wasatch County, Utah. Elizabeth has given interviews over the years, though always on her own terms. In October 2003, she and her parents sat down with Katie Couric for Dateline NBC, Elizabeth's first media interview. She also appeared on Oprah, but not every interview went smoothly. In July 2006, Nancy Grace invited Elizabeth on her show supposedly to discuss pending legislation on sex offender registration. Instead, Grace kept pushing Elizabeth for details about her captivity. Elizabeth pushed back. "I really am here to support the bill and not to go into what happened to me." When Grace persisted, asking what it was like seeing out of the face coverings her abductors forced her to wear, Elizabeth shut it down. "I'm really not going to talk about this at this time. And to be frankly honest, I really don't appreciate you bringing all this up." Grace finally backed off. Elizabeth's story led to real change. 1 month after her rescue, Utah superseded its existing Rachel Alert system with a nationwide Amber Alert system for child abductions. On March 18, 2003, Elizabeth even joined her parents in writing an open letter to the U.S. House of Representatives supporting Amber Alert legislation. She'd just been rescued and was already fighting to help other kids. In 2017, she produced a TV film called I Am Elizabeth Smart, telling her story in her own words. She's written books. She's testified before Congress. She appeared on the rebooted America's Most Wanted in January 2024 to discuss child abductions. Through it all, Elizabeth has been remarkably open about the reality of trauma and recovery. She's talked about how rape doesn't define a person's worth, how victims shouldn't be made to feel like damaged goods. She's advocated for better sex education that doesn't use shame-based metaphors. She's pushed back against victim blaming and the idea that survivors should just get over it. The Elizabeth Smart case is one of those stories that sticks with you because it reveals uncomfortable truths about how predators operate and how systems can fail. First, let's talk about the warning signs that were missed. Mitchell had a documented history of sexual offenses and boundary violations going back to when he was 16. Multiple women had accused him of abuse. Child Protective Services had been involved. Yet he was still able to move freely, marry multiple times, and eventually kidnap and rape a child for 9 months. The system knew about him, but the system failed. Second, the competency battle exposed how defendants can manipulate the legal process. Mitchell's courtroom antics, singing hymns, screaming at judges, happened only in front of the court. Jail staff never saw these behaviors. Experts ultimately concluded he was malingering, faking symptoms to delay trial. And it worked for years, forcing Elizabeth to wait nearly a decade for justice. Third, the library incident shows how predators exploit social politeness and religious deference. When the detective confronted Mitchell, Barzee, and Elizabeth, Mitchell immediately played the religion card, claiming their faith prohibited women from speaking or showing their faces in public. The detective, not wanting to appear intolerant or violate religious freedom, backed off. Mitchell weaponized our cultural reluctance to challenge religious claims, and it kept Elizabeth trapped for 7 more months. Fourth, Mary Catherine's role in solving the case demonstrates that children often hold critical information, but may need time to process trauma before they can access it. It took her 4 months to remember where she'd heard the kidnapper's voice. Police were skeptical because of the time delay and the brief interaction the family had with Emmanuel. But she was right. We need to listen to kids, even when their timeline seems improbable. Fifth, Elizabeth's survival required incredible mental strength. She was repeatedly raped, starved, drugged, and psychologically tortured. She was threatened with death. She was forced to participate in a fake marriage ceremony and take on a new identity. She was paraded in public but couldn't call for help because she'd been conditioned to believe her family would be killed if she tried to escape. Yet she survived. And she didn't just survive. She came out the other side, determined to help others. The SMART case also highlighted gaps in alert systems. Utah had the Rachel alert system at the time of Elizabeth's kidnapping, but it wasn't as widely known or implemented as the Amber Alert system that replaced it. Elizabeth's abduction became part of the push to adopt Amber Alert nationwide, potentially saving countless children since then. There's also the uncomfortable reality that Elizabeth was taken into public spaces multiple times and nobody effectively intervened. Yes, someone called police at the library, but when the detective didn't push hard enough, that was it. People saw this family dressed in unusual religious clothing and thought it was odd. But they didn't imagine a kidnapped child might be under those veils. We're trained not to intrude, not to be rude, not to make assumptions. Sometimes that social conditioning protects people's privacy and freedom. Other times, it protects predators. Elizabeth Smart's story could have ended so many different ways. Statistically, most kidnapped children who aren't recovered within the first 24 hours don't come home alive. Elizabeth was gone for 9 months. 9 months of daily sexual assault, psychological torture, and physical captivity. She could have been another tragic statistic. Instead, she became a survivor who refuses to stay silent. Today, Elizabeth is a wife, a mother of 3, an advocate, and a voice for the voiceless. She's turned her trauma into purpose, using her platform to push for policy changes, support other survivors, and educate the public about the realities of kidnapping and sexual assault. Mitchell will die in prison. Barzy is out but monitored. And Elizabeth? She's living her life on her own terms, refusing to let what happened to her dictate what happens next. That 14-year-old girl who was ripped from her bed at knife point, who survived 9 months of hell, who kept hoping even when a detective walked away from her in that library. She made it home. And then she made it her mission to help others find their way home too. If there's one thing this case teaches us, it's that monsters are real. They don't always look like monsters. They sometimes dress in white robes, quote scripture, and smile politely. They exploit our better instincts, our respect for religion, our reluctance to intrude, our assumption that parents protect their children. But it also teaches us that survival is possible, that speaking up matters, that fighting for justice, even when it takes 8 years, is worth it. That one person's voice, whether it's a 9-year-old remembering a voice or a survivor choosing to tell her story, can change everything. Elizabeth Smart was 14 when she was taken. She's in her 30s now, raising her own kids, protecting other people's kids, and showing the world that trauma doesn't get the last word. She does. And that's the real story here. Not just the nightmare she endured, but the warrior she became because of it. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and smash the like. It helps this community grow and makes sure stories like this one aren't forgotten. This case took decades to crack, and trust me, you're not going to want to miss a single detail. Also, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how many people around the world care about justice just as much as I do.